Good morning, everyone. My name is Cassie Hopkins, and I help coordinate the webinars for Hausman Johnson Insurance and the Benefits Services Group. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Your Fleet, One of Your Biggest Exposures, presented by Rick Barton. I would like everybody to know just a couple things before we start the webinar. This webinar is interactive and will feature a question and answer session. You can submit your questions at any time into the questions feature. If that's not working for you, you can also send it into the chat feature as well. There is a question and answer session, and that's when we will answer questions at that time. After the webinar is over, there will be a short survey we are hoping you can fill out for us to give us feedback on the webinar and webinar topics you are interested in learning more about. And most importantly, this webinar is recorded and it will be available on the webinar archives section of our website, and each attendee will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and the presentation slides. I would now like to introduce you to our presenter, Rick Barton. Rick has over 20 years of experience in safety and risk control, working with clients in many industries, including construction, mining, trucking, manufacturing, and hospitality. He specializes in assessing risk for the clients of Hausman Johnson Insurance to reduce loss potential. Additionally, he has been asked to speak at local and national safety conferences on topics such as how to manage safety on a job site, and what it takes to be a safety leader. Rick is an authorized instruction of OSHA regulations, construction, and general industry regulations. He is also an active member of the Wisconsin Transportation Builders Association, the WTBA, the Associated Builders and Contractors, the ABC, the Wisconsin chapter of the American Society for Safety Engineers, ASSE, and the Association of General Contractors. We are very grateful to have Rick with us to share his knowledge. Welcome, Rick.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Cassie. I appreciate the nice introduction. And welcome everyone that joined us for this webinar. It's great to be able to speak on a topic that I think we often don't put as much emphasis into it, because it's one of those areas that, unless we have a large fleet or unless we have a regulated fleet, we tend to forget about our exposures when it comes to the vehicles that we have on the road while we're conducting business. And so that's kind of what I was putting when I was putting this together. That was the thought process that was going through my head. Some people might also hear this term, the unfleet. In other words, you might have a large fleet of vehicles that are regulated by DOT. They might be vehicles that are in commerce, over 10,000 pounds, or trailer and truck combination over 10,000 pounds that is regulated. You may have vehicles over 26,000 pounds, which are even more regulated and require commercial driver's licenses to drive those vehicles. Well, that's not what I planned on speaking much about, because when I work with customers that have regulated fleets, they tend to do a pretty good job with making sure the individuals and the equipment that they're using are going to reduce exposures to their company. So when I was putting this together, I was thinking about the amount of exposure companies put on the road every single day without giving it a thought. In other words, you might have a fleet of 2 or 3 vehicles, maybe a company truck, and maybe a couple sales guys that have company vehicles, and you have insurance because you need to have insurance. It's the law. But do you do anything to assure that those pieces of equipment are in good condition, and are the drivers you would want to put behind your vehicle to reduce your exposures? So that's kind of the background of the way I put this webinar together, is to let people think about, are they doing what they need to do to protect their company assets? If you guys have looked at your auto rates over the last couple of years, you can see they're going up, and they're going up very, very quickly. And if you have an accident, they're going to go up even quicker, as we know, because accidents stay on records for many, many years. And if you have personal insurance, which I'm sure everyone does on this call, you have you get a ticket, you get an accident, your rates are going to be affected for at least 3 years, depending on your carrier. Could be longer, right? And we also know that the insurance carriers tell us daily that auto losses are driving rates. They're driving rates through the roof for some companies. Why? Because the exposure is there. On average, I think this statistic comes from 2018. It might not be last year's statistic. Insurance carriers had $230 billion in auto losses that they had to pay out. $230 billion. That comes to $820 per person in the United States. That's a lot of money. How many of us pay $820 for 1 year's worth of coverage on our personal auto, yet the company autos? Now, if you got a Maserati or you got a high valued car, you're going to have higher rates. If you have a poor driving record, you're going to have higher rates. But the average driver, say 25 and over, probably with no accidents, no claims, probably doesn't pay $820 on your average vehicle per year. They could. I'm not saying they don't, but they could. So that's why I wanted to focus on, are we doing the right thing to protect our company assets? The title is Your Fleet, One of Your Biggest Exposures, and it is. Obviously, workers' compensation is a very large exposure for companies with employees in certain industries. Property insurance is an exposure also. But when we think about auto rates, we do have a very, very large exposure. Hey, Cassie, can you flip the slide for me? Thank you. For some reason, it's not working. There we go. And the reason these rates are going up, everyone, is because if you look in the past 5, 10 years, we have seen awards for auto accidents go through the roof. Punitive damages have gone up. There's millions and millions of dollars awarded in single cases. A few years back, Coca-Cola had a truck that got in an accident, and the punitive damages awarded by the courts were $21 million. There was a verdict back in Texas in 2019, just last year, where the courts awarded $27 million. I'm sure it's being appealed, but that's out there. And I could probably put up hundreds and hundreds more of verdicts that have occurred throughout the United States where millions of dollars are being awarded to plaintiffs that get in auto accidents. And it's not always your big trucks. It's not always your 18-wheelers going down the road, but it could be a company car. And sometimes these occur because you are doing things that maybe we shouldn't be doing while we're driving our vehicles. So my goal this morning is to give you some information on what can we do to minimize our exposure, control our exposure, and better yet, protect your workers from being hurt and or other personnel that you come in contact from being hurt. So that's kind of my goal as we go through this whole program this morning. And I would look at it from a standpoint of, are you doing some of the basic things? And again, take it in respect that I am not really going to focus on that regulated fleet. You've got a bunch of trucks that are regulated by the Department of Transportation. I'm not looking at those vehicles because we do a pretty good job. I'm not saying you couldn't use some of these principles in that concept, but that's not really what I was looking for or looking at when we deal with these large auto verdicts. And if you want to control your exposures, you're going to have to look at long-term systems so that you have proven to the courts that you are doing the right thing. Next slide, Cassie. For some reason it's not working. Thank you. So what do you have in place to control your fleet? And I'll give you an example. You might have 8, 9, 10 salespeople out on a highway. You might have another couple employees that might use their vehicles to drive from site to site. And they might just be a small pickup truck or a company car. It might be their own vehicle, but they're using it in the course of business. Do you have a policy? And does that policy really go through what they are allowed to do, what they are not allowed to do? And I'll get into that a little bit. I'll talk about that as we go through this. Do you have a procedure for determining if drivers are drivers that would be drivers you'd want to put on the road and put your name behind them, your company name? We have to do a really nice job of evaluating our drivers so that we know we're putting safe drivers on the road. If we don't evaluate our drivers and we just put our head in the sand and say, well, I'll worry about that later. Well, later when they get in an accident and a good lawyer gets a hold of the accident file and finds out that this driver was really not even, maybe had a bad record, we could have some serious problems. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about, do we follow up on what our drivers are doing? So do we have policies and procedures? And I'll go through all that. I'm just setting the stage for what I want to spend some time on. And then finally, do we follow through? So we might have policies and procedures and we might follow up on those. In other words, we might check motor vehicle records, but then do we follow through and do something if action is needed? It would be great if we were all on this call and every one of our drivers, when we check their MBR, they haven't had a violation in the last 5 years, they haven't had an accident in the last 5 years. That would be great. But let's get back to reality. You know, people get speeding tickets. People do go through stop signs. It happens, and it's going to happen. That does not mean they're a bad driver, but do we have systems in place that at least address that? So I would like to spend the next half hour or so talking about some of the things that and policies and procedures, elements of a good safety program or a fleet that I would expect you to have. And again, keep in mind, you can use all these elements in a regulated fleet, but you would also have to do the regulated fleet issues like checking, making sure they're logging and making sure they're doing their daily vehicle inspection reports. So again, take this all in perspective. I'm talking about the unregulated fleet that we may or may not have. So next slide, please. So I would like to start with a quick question to everyone. And again, when I ask these questions, I just ask for you to think about your own fleet. The only way you're going to know if you have controls is if you're honest and you look at what you have and decide if it's working and if it's adequate. But do you have a company driver handbook that sets up the expectations of your drivers? You know, drivers, if they don't know what's expected of them, how are they supposed to comply or be within the requirements of your company? Do you have any rules or policies? Some companies, they might issue a company car and the only person allowed to drive that car is the company employee. No spouses, no children, things of that nature. Other companies, they may allow a spouse. Again, that's an exposure that you have to decide if you're going to take on that exposure. If you're going to take on that exposure, there's some things that you must or should do. I shouldn't say must because none of these are must, they're shoulds. We can always find insurance for you, but the whole issue is we've got to do some things to make you look good in the marketplace so that we can find good rates, better rates, and adequate rates for what you do. So do you have a driver handbook? And then do you have some rules and policies for your drivers? You know, you might have a rule that you cannot use your company pickup truck to attach a non-work related trailer and take it on vacation unless you get special permission. And that's going to be on a case-by-case basis. Some companies might decide that, you know what, I've given a guy an individual truck and he can use it for personal use. And if that personal use includes towing a personal trailer or maybe a camper or maybe a utility trailer for some things he's doing around the house, that's fine. But you have to understand you've accepted that exposure. And that exposure now creates a bigger risk for you as a company. And that's a decision you need to make. I would not sit here and say that you can't do that. I would say that you have to evaluate that exposure and realize that you've accepted that exposure and that potential risk. So let's go through and talk about what you would want in your handbook and driver policy. So the next slide, we will talk a little bit about what you need. What components do you have to protect your company? I often say the minimum thing is you at least need a vehicle use policy. When can we use your vehicle? What can we use it for? And what
Hey,
are
Rick.
some of the exceptions? Yep. Go ahead, Kathy.
We're getting comments that your audio is going in and out. Would you mind trying without your earbuds?
Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Thanks, though. I appreciate that, because if we don't let the speaker know you can't hear them, then you don't get what you need out of the seminar, and we just wasted time. So I appreciate that comment. I always do. That's great. So, hey, so back on topic and back to point. So if you all have to take a look at components of your company fleet program, and one of those might be a vehicle use policy. And I kind of just spent a little bit of time talking about that, but that can be very elaborate, or it can be very short. And I'm going to spend more time talking about that. I would expect that you have some type of a driver eligibility. I put scoring in here, but requirements. In other words, maybe the driver has to be at least 21 years of age. I'm not saying they have to. You could let people drive under that age, but that's a company policy. You may have a scoring requirement that when I check their motor vehicle records, they are going to score at least X based on your scoring criteria and their past driving records. I would also expect that within your company policies, you would have some type of an investigation or incident analysis requirement. So if I do get in a company an incident, whether it's a small incident or a large incident, and I'm okay, I'm not physically hurt, I can do some basic investigations. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about driving improvement skills and things like that, things that you can offer people that might not be the best drivers. If anyone's gotten a ticket in the last few years in Wisconsin and it was a moving violation, there's a good chance that the state of Wisconsin required you to go through some defensive driving class or some awareness class, and you had to go online and take it. I've heard people tell me this. I'm not sure if it's 100% true for every moving violation, and maybe it depends on how many you've had. But there's things you can do internally also that can make people better drivers. I'm gonna spend a little time on that. And then finally, but there's other things like daily vehicle inspection reports. So we've got those things. And then probably the big ticket items are we doing any cell phone? Do we have a cell phone policy? What is our policy? How do we enforce that policy? It's really hard to enforce, but if employees know that it's there, they may be more apt to self-enforce it when they're driving the vehicles for company time. And then last but not least, I'll spend a little bit of time on drug testing. So if we can slide to the next slide, Cassie. So your vehicle use policy, real simple. Who's permitted? Do you let all employees and their families drive your vehicles? Do you let all employees drive any vehicle? I will go into companies occasionally, and a lot of times it's a follow-up to an insurance carrier's recommendation, and they'll say, hey, you need to have a policy, and you know what, we've got to make sure that we don't have anyone under 21 driving the box truck from around town. So that might be a permitted use. What is the use of company equipment? That might also be something that is limited, as I mentioned before. So we need to think about what we want to set up for rules. And on this webinar, I couldn't sit here and tell you exactly what needs to be in each one of your policies because I don't know your risk tolerance. If you have more risk tolerance, or you feel you have really good employees, which I'm sure we all do, maybe we let them have more leeway. But then also accept the fact that you might down the road, if you accept that you're going to give them more leeway, you may have that claim, that serious injury or that serious accident that may go past your auto limits, go into your umbrella coverage. And you know, if you don't have coverage that is acceptable, maybe get into the company assets. So that's important. So there's many guidelines you can use there. I would recommend that if you're not really sure, let's talk offline. I don't want to get specific on this because people have very specific questions. You know, a good example is you take a look at that picture. I took that picture, everyone. That's actually a live picture. I did not take it. My son actually took it in the back seat a few weeks back. We were driving up in Minnesota on 494 on the south side of the road, and that boat and that trailer were sitting on the road about noon on a Sunday morning. I hope that wasn't a company vehicle. The guy was towing his truck or his boat with it, but apparently he didn't strap it down. We let people use our company vehicles for a lot of things. So think about what you're going to allow them to use it for. Then we have the old issue about personally owned vehicles. I'm going to ask everyone to be honest. If you have personally owned vehicles that are being used in business, and we see a lot of this for salespeople, project managers, people that need to travel, even if they only have to travel, down the road to a meeting, or maybe they have to go to a seminar. Are we requiring certain levels of insurance? Maybe 100, 300,000 coverage, something like that. Maybe you might not want to go to the state minimums, things like that. Do you require additional insured provisions? Do you require that you get a certificate of insurance from these drivers that are driving on company time with their own vehicle? You'd be surprised how many people drive without insurance, even though it's a state law. Now, you would expect that your employees are going to have that responsibility. You pay them a decent wage. They're doing work for you. They're going to have insurance. Well, sometimes insurance lapses and we don't get it renewed on time. And so if we're checking our certificates of insurance, making sure people are giving us certificates at their renewal dates, then we know that they have adequate coverages that are going to protect you. As we know, the insurance follows the vehicle, but if the limits are exhausted, they're going to come at the company assets if they were doing things on company business, if things do happen. And we've seen this happen time and time again. I'm not saying with our customers, but I've seen it happen. So if we can move on to the next slide. So you've got your driver policy and procedures. You know what's accepted. You know what's allowed. Now, what are we going to do or you know what the practices are? Now, do you have some way to determine whether or not your drivers are eligible to drive a company vehicle? Do you do a motor vehicle record check? And if you do, when they come in as a new employee, are you comparing it to anything? If you don't compare it to anything, what good is it? So I hired two people one day, and they're both going to drive either their personal vehicles or company vehicles. They're both about the same age. Let's say they're within a year of each other. They're 30 and they're 29, just an example. One has a DUI 5 years ago, driving under the influence 5 years ago, and the other one has one last year. Which one's going to make a better driver? Well, you might say neither of them, right? Well, that's your policy, that's your policy. But the one that happened a little more recent probably is a better indication that driver might not be the best driver because time does heal things and time does make us better. But if you're just looking at motor vehicle records and you see that you got two people that have, one has a couple speeding tickets in the last 4 years and one has nothing, obviously the one with nothing is going to be a great driver, but the other one might just be right on that fringe. We might still let them drive, but we have to compare it to something. So I would recommend that you use a point system and you compare violations, get assigned certain points, and if they don't meet your point requirement, they can't drive until their points come down and they're within your driving requirements. For all of us in Wisconsin, we can register all our drivers on PARs. It's cost free, or it doesn't cost anything. You sign them up. It might be a small cost for the initial sign up. I think there is, if I recall right. But you sign them up once, right? And then and then every time you get a driving violation, you get notified by the state and you pay at that time. So it's kind of a pay as you go. But what you're doing is you're registering your driver so that you know whether or not they do have a violation. Again, we register our CDL drivers because we have to know, they have to let us know, but we need to do more with our non-CDL or regulated drivers. If you have the employees outside the state, you can use a couple of the MVR check systems that I put on the screen. I'm not saying one works better than the other. There's cost to both of them. But if you've got 10 salespeople across the country, it might be a good idea to be checking their motor vehicle records on a regular basis. Salespeople are out with customers. Sometimes they have to entertain them, and they're the face of the company, and we want to make sure we put a good face in front of our customers. So that's important. You might have a superintendent that runs a project somewhere. They might not be hauling a trailer, so they don't meet any of the requirements for commercial drivers, but you might want them to at least check their motor vehicle records. And if they don't live in the state of Wisconsin, we're going to have to go and use one of these national databases. And they work pretty good. Most companies I've talked to that have used them have no problem using them. But again, the biggest thing, do you check your motor vehicle records? Not only for drivers that drive company vehicles, but also individuals that drive their own vehicles on company time. So next slide, Cassie. So now that we have our policy in place, we know what our drivers can and can't do or are allowed to do. Now we check their motor vehicle records. Now we got great drivers, but oops, guess what happens? We got the best driver in the world. We hit the snow season and bam, we end up in the ditch, right? Maybe we hit a car as we're going into that ditch, right? So what are we doing in order to do an incident analysis, an accident report? Now, if an employee or a driver is injured, obviously we're not going to expect them to do an incident analysis or an accident investigation. But if they're not hurt, the best thing to do is have some type of a format in the glove compartment somewhere in the vehicle, maybe on their laptop, iPad or their iPhone, whatever they have, so they can fill in some questions, get some basic information. Everyone on this call probably knows the best time to get information is as soon as that incident happened, because as that incident gets farther and farther away in time, we tend to forget what happened, and everything is fresh in our mind. We may not have been the one at fault, and so therefore we need to do a better job at protecting our assets. So we want to make sure that we have some type of a reporting process. Now, in today's day and age, I know very few people that don't have the ability to take pictures with their phone, but some people still require maybe a portable or a disposable camera in the glove compartment. So there's no excuse. I didn't run out of battery charge. The phone wasn't working this day. I didn't have reception. All those other things that we get, or I didn't have the ability to take a picture, whatever it is. I mean, I've heard them all. You don't have to have reception to take pictures, but I've heard that excuse. Well, I was in an area with no cell service, but you couldn't take a picture? Oh, okay. Well, so we'll get on it. But the big thing here is that you actually have a little bit of a procedure, and this is going to help you out in several ways. You're going to be able to get information that's real time, happened at the time of the incident, as long as no one got seriously hurt or was hurt where they were incapacitated. But the other thing is it provides a driver time to explain himself, kind of put his thoughts together, especially when they're not at fault. Maybe they're in a different type of incident, but even if they're at fault, it helps them. And then the big thing here is, do you follow through? Do you review it with the driver? Was there anything that happened? Everyone on the call, I had an incident a couple of weeks ago, a client sent to me, and he said one of his guys, he went through an intersection and he got T-boned. Sounds like he was at fault. He was fine. He took some pictures. I got pictures of the incident. We're going to follow up. They followed up already. We're doing some additional follow-up. But the most important thing, everyone, is that we had that ability to take some pictures and find out what's going on. And if a driver's at fault, they're at fault. We can't change what happened in the past. So put that accident kit in the vehicle. That would be an accident report. Make sure they take pictures. And hey, by the way, we treat all our commercial drivers. We make sure they have safety equipment in the car. Maybe we should make sure our other vehicles have fire extinguishers, fuses, other seasonal equipment like blankets, things like that. Maybe a shovel this time of year. I just drove through a snowstorm a few weeks back on my way over to Minneapolis on a Tuesday, and a lot of cars in the ditch, and I bet most of them probably didn't have their shovels and stuff ready. So we got to have that stuff. Again, these are all issues that can help you prevent your fleet from being that exposure that causes our company financial headaches. So that's pretty important. Next slide, please, Cassie. So you've got these great drivers, but you know what? You get a driver that maybe he's having a bad spell and maybe he has an incident, right? And he's at fault. Well, maybe you make or maybe you review their driver's motor vehicle record, and you find out that they've had a few violations on there, right when they started. Or maybe they become a driver and you find out that maybe they weren't the best driver. Well, maybe within your policy you say that, hey, anyone that's over X number of points over a 3 or 4 or 5 year period, they've got to take a driver safety course, a defensive driver course. You can have them take those online. They can go to one of the technical colleges. You can go to the National Safety Council, the Wisconsin Safety Council. They all have defensive driving courses. And by the way, the other thing you might want to do is anyone that is driver eligible, that may drive a vehicle on company time, they have to go through maybe a half-hour defensive driving class. And defensive driving doesn't mean anything more than just being aware of what's on the road. Here at Hausman Johnson, Jeff Dutton, my other risk control consultant that works with me, and myself, we do defensive driving for clients fairly frequently. And it's not getting you out in your vehicle and going on a skid pad. It's just recognizing things that may come up while you're driving and looking at following distance and looking at keeping your eyes moving from your one side mirror to the other side mirror. So it's not real complicated, but it's a good reminder. And you know, those reminders stick in your head. So you do that for all your drivers. And then if anyone does get in a bind where maybe they get in an accident that they were at fault, that requires maybe a defensive driving class. And you give them, a month, 2 months to take that class, and they retain their driving privileges within your company. You know what happens? People realize that if you're serious about this, that they'll be serious about taking this class. And if they really respect and want their job, they'll do this. And if they don't, well, then they don't get the driving privileges. And if they don't have the driving privileges, maybe they can't perform their jobs. And again, I realize that some of you are probably thinking, well, Rick, he's a great employee, we just don't want to lose him. Well, if that great employee is such that they're going to cause a serious accident down the road, it might financially impact your company. And that's why your fleet is one of your biggest exposures. And that's why you need to control that fleet, because there aren't that many controls that you can't watch that driver drive all over the state, all over the city, wherever you're at. You need to be able to trust those drivers that they're going to do the right thing. And if you look at their past history, you're going to realize that, the past history will be a good barometer of what's going to happen in the future. People will change, but they have to be given reason to change, right? So with that, we're going to move on to the next slide. And I want to spend a little bit of time about daily vehicle inspections. I always say, people say, Rick, why would you have someone inspect their company car? Well, I don't know. It takes about 5 minutes to walk around a car. If it's the one you drive every day, I wouldn't expect you have to do it every day, but maybe you do it once a week. We require an individual that has a truck over 10,001 pounds or a truck and trailer over that amount of weight to do a daily vehicle inspection report. You might have even a more valuable vehicle that they're using that's not regulated by the DOT. Why not have them do one? That way you also are doing what a prudent company would do. And if a light is out, we get that light fixed. If the brakes are bad, or we've got a cracked windshield, whatever it is, we get those things fixed. If they're not safety critical, we get them fixed, in time. If they're safety critical, we get them on a maintenance plan. But what it does is, if you do have that serious accident where somebody is seriously hurt and it's not one of your employees, but your employee caused the accident, this might help in reducing your liability, that you're doing the things that you need to do. That vehicle was inspected. We did check the motor vehicle record. We provided defensive driving for these drivers. We're doing what prudent companies would do to assure we have the best possible drivers on the road. And therefore, the lawyers, the court systems are probably going to have less apt to jack up those awards at the end. So I think it's pretty important. And so daily vehicle inspections can be very simple. Maybe you just have someone do a weekly inspection for maybe a company, a car, or whatever that's not regulated by the DOT. So with that, let's move on to the next slide as we get into what I call Oh, back up, there you go. What I call the one that gets all of us. How do we regulate our cell phone use? I am not gonna sit here and tell everyone that there's never ever, you never ever have the ability to use a cell phone in a vehicle. What I'm asking is that you use good common sense and you have a policy. So establish a policy of you pull over and call back. Okay. Everyone says, well, hands-free is the way to go. And, you know, I can make all the calls I want when I'm hands-free. Well, the National Safety Council has proven and has studies that will show you that hands-free is no safer than a held cell phone. The issue is in some states, you're not allowed to use a phone unless it's hands-free. You go down to Illinois and other states, it's not allowed. You go into some jurisdictions, it's not allowed. Just because it's hands-free does not make it safer. So I would ask everyone, at least have a policy. Have a policy and remind people that they should pull over. There's probably no call that's more important. It's so important that they need to take it while they're driving. You know, that's something I would encourage. And absolutely no internet surfing, no texting. Those are always things that we need to think about when we're in the car. You know, the whole goal of defensive driving is to limit your distractions, focus your attention on the road, look at what's coming. And as soon as we take our eyes off and look at our phone, or even when we're talking with a hands-free phone, our mind is not thinking about what's in front of us. It's thinking about the next question that that person is asking us. And we've probably all done this. And if there is someone on this phone on the line that hasn't, where you've taken a call and you've just driven 20 miles and don't remember anything about those 20 miles while you're on that call, that's what's happening. Now, subconsciously you were looking at stuff, but not consciously. So it's all about distracted driving. And I know this is a tough one because everyone feels they have to be more productive than the next guy, and that downtime, that hour of driving every day to and from work or to that job site or to that, you know, that customer that we need to service, that's important. I would just encourage everyone to reduce that and try to reduce it as much as possible. And at least, you know, if you're going to allow it, you've got to go to hands-free 100%. Again, I'm not for that, but I understand company policies and stuff like that. So once we're done with that, we're going to go to the next slide and talk about drugs and alcohol, which we believe that, you know, if you're going to be testing your commercial drivers because it's a law, is there any reason why you wouldn't test everyone else? And I know someone on the call, if you're in HR, you're saying, you know, Rick, we can't find employees. I hear this right now because we can't find enough employees to do the job. And, you know, if we test, we're limiting our pool. I understand that. But when you're putting people behind a vehicle, you know, you've got it. If you've got a car, you're talking about a 3,000 pound death trap. If you've got a company pickup truck, you're talking about a 4,000 to 7,000 pound vehicle that could be very, very dangerous. So why not test employees that are allowed to drive? If they're not willing to test, then do you really want them driving your company vehicles? And that might be it. You might decide if you're going to get a company vehicles, those are ones you test. If you drive your own vehicle, maybe we're not. Again, I don't like that loophole. I would encourage you not to do that, but I've seen it, and I'm not saying you could not do that. So, you know, there's very simple ways to screen people, inexpensive ways. You can do rapid testing and then get it confirmed if they're positive through a test. But, you know, if you don't check, you'll never know if they are positive and using some types of drugs and alcohol. Now, with the advent of, you know, the legalization of marijuana in some states and things like that, there's going to be limited testing, or there might be testing that we can't do. And I don't have time to talk about all those legal requirements right now during this webinar. I'd love to offline if anybody wants to talk about them, because we do very often when we help companies evaluate their drug and alcohol programs. But you know, if you got people driving these big vehicles out on the road in uncontrolled circumstances, because you never know who the next vehicle is that's coming around the corner, I would expect that you would have this as a minimum. So if you go back and look at what your biggest exposure is, it's probably workers' comp, right? That's what we all think until you get the lawsuit. You get that verdict for $1 million. You get that verdict for $1.5 million because your company, your employee was driving on company time and they hit that bus full of children, and now we've got injured children, or we hit someone and we did do a, we blew right through a red light, we blew right through a stop sign because we were on the cell phone. It's real easy to go back and find out what was happening in that vehicle through cell phone information. So everyone on the call, everyone on the webinar, think about your fleet. If you can honestly say you're doing all these things, I praise you 100%. If you're doing all of them, are we doing them to the level we want? Are we following through? We've got the policies. We've implemented those policies. We've checked the MVRs. But then did we do something with that MVR? Did we do something with that drug and alcohol test? Did we do something with that defensive driving training? Have we required everyone to do it? So everyone on the call, I hope that you're thinking about these things, and can we fine tune it? I bet the reason most people called in is because they're looking at how to fine tune their program. And again, Hausman Johnson has handbooks available or program guidelines. If you want those, we can always send those out to you. But if you just want us to review what you have, we will take a look at that and give you some feedback. What are some things you need? What are some things that we like in your policies and procedures? So, and again, it all goes back to execution, all right? We can have everything we want on paper, but if we don't execute it and make it real in the field, in other words, make sure people are doing it, it's probably not going to help you. So Cassie, can you move on to the next slide as we wrap this thing up? So in conclusion, a fleet risk control program, I would say it's not even a choice. If you have company vehicles and you are allowing people to drive on company time for company purposes, you need to have a fleet risk control program. It's going to reduce your injuries and property damage. We know that because it's going to make people aware. You're going to hire and keep better drivers. You're going to assure that people are doing the right thing because they know they're being watched. If people know you're checking their MVRs and they know that if they're registered with PARS and they have a violation, you're going to know about it. It's a good checks and balances. And I go back to that PARS issue. You might have a company policy that says if you have a violation while driving a company car, you need to let the company know. Well, PARS lets you know. And guess what? If that person doesn't let you know for a month and you've already known for a couple of days, are they following the policy? They might be a great employee, but they need to be honest to you. That fleet risk control will reduce your cost of commercial auto coverage because we'll have less losses, and that's going to reduce your premium. You want to look attractive to those insurance carriers, and right now they're moving rates up all the time. You can do that. Just look at your personal auto rates. You don't have an accident for 3 years, but yet your rate's going up 10% every year. You might get lucky and get a reduction once in a while, but they got to make up for that $230 billion that are being spent on auto losses and large awards. So we're available here. We've got available materials. If you're ready, we're to be prepared. We're here to help you guys. We're here to make review things for you. And if you don't have all these things in place, and maybe there's something that you want to put in place or add to your policy to make your fleet program better, let us know. And let's get started on this and keep working on it. So with that, I will turn it back over to Cassie because she's going to be our moderator for any questions, and I'll be more than happy. Looks like I got done a couple minutes early, so that's great. We can talk about some of the items that you may have questions on.
Yes, so if you have any questions for Rick, please type them into the question and answer feature on GoToWebinar. We'd love to hear from you and hear any feedback or suggestions or questions you have. There was one that came in fairly early in the webinar saying, along with vehicle inspection, should you add periodic load secure inspection?
That would be ultimate. I mean, that would be great because obviously there's load securement for any regulated vehicle, right? But if you are not securing your load and you're not a regulated vehicle, you're going to be under the same, you'll get a ticket for that, for improper load securement. It could be as simple as, and this, I just share with you this because it happened to a buddy of mine. He had a bike rack that broke loose and fell off, and it didn't cause any accidents, but when the state trooper came over, he got a ticket for improper load securement because he didn't check it beforehand. But that would be anything. If you got just a pickup truck or maybe a cargo van and you're putting stuff on top, they got to secure it properly. And then you might want to give them some ideas on what that needs to be. No bungee cords are not allowed for commercial vehicles. Why would we allow them for non-commercial vehicles? Definitely have a load securement policy. Great point.
Here is a kind of a follow-up comment to that. Construction loads will shift and people need to be aware of that. How do you make the drivers aware of those construction loads shifting?
Well, the best thing to do is do what a commercial driver does. And, after they're on the road for 10 or 15 minutes, they pull over and they check their loads. And there are some requirements for certain types of loads where you do have to check those regularly. So you can do the same thing with a construction load. Just check it. After you're on the road for 20 minutes, you pull over and you just inspect it. That's the best way to take care of that.
All right, for retraining, this is from an HR perspective, for retraining employees who have been on the job and you're implementing these new policies, how would you best go about retraining new staff, existing staff? What's the best method for that?
Yeah, so this is what I would recommend is that, we'll look at it from two perspectives. First is your existing staff. If you decide that you're going to do a short hour defensive driving class for anyone that's required to drive a company vehicle, you might say that they've got a year to get through that class and maybe offer it 2 or 3 times during the year. Or maybe it's only offered once, then everyone's got to go at that time. Again, I don't know how large you are. That might be one way. And then for new drivers, they would have to get in within that first year. As long as their driving records and everything check out, that they wouldn't need it up front. If someone then there's the next level. If someone then has maybe some driving issues, maybe they get a few too many speeding tickets, or maybe they get into a serious accident or a couple accidents, and they just they go through a bad time. And part of your policy says they have to go through defensive driving. You say, well, once we make that decision, they've got X months to go through it, 3 months, 2 months, but they have to go through it. Otherwise, they lose their driving privileges. I work with a company right now that they have all their company drivers, actually. Anyone that drives on company business, personal auto, anything, I think it's every 3 years they have to go through a defensive driving class. So the first year they got everyone through, and then they offer it every year. So all the new employees go through it. And then anyone that continues to drive every 3rd year, they have to go back through the defensive driving class. And you can offer it online if you want. You could get the National Safety Conference online course. You could have Hausman Johnson come in. We do that for companies. It's usually about 45 minutes is usually what it takes. So a couple different ways to deal with that one, but give them time. Don't make it mandatory they have to do it in a month. Give them some time, unless they're one of those problem drivers that maybe we need to really focus on.
Great answer. Thanks, Rick. The next question is, can an insurance company refuse to insure/cover an employee with a questionable driving record?
Absolutely. They can ask you to have a driver removed from your driving list, and they are not allowed to drive on company business with a company vehicle at all. So if you've got a bunch of vehicles and you're assigning them to them, they'll just say that person cannot drive a company vehicle. See it all the time. They'll just give us a list of bad drivers. We have to inform the insured that those drivers are not allowed to drive company vehicles at all. They might make some exceptions. They might say that person has to go through a defensive driving class or something like that. But typically, they just say these are not allowed drivers. After a year or two, they might get back on the list as allowed drivers. Good question, though. It does happen more often than you probably realize.
Here's a related question to that. Can that driver, so the driver who has been declined by the insurance carrier, can they drive a personal vehicle while doing company work?
Sure, if you want to take on that risk, you can let them do that. I would advise that you also put them through some training, defensive driver training, make that a requirement, and that you make sure their limits are high enough that they'll be, again, typically when you have a driver like that, their insurance gets pretty expensive. And they may just cut their limits way back to keep their costs down. So you might have a requirement to have 100, 300, 1,000 limits on your policies for insurance, and just make sure they keep up with that. If you decide to make an exception to that, I mean, there are one-offs. I'm not saying you can't do that. I would just not encourage that. But as long as it's a personal vehicle, that's fine. I was talking to a gentleman once. He got, the company wouldn't let him drive, and he couldn't get his license back. So he had a guy chauffeur him around for like 8 months before he could get his license back because he didn't want to lose his job. And he was a sales guy. It happens.
Wow, I feel like that's a unique experience.
Very unique.
Looking to see if there's any more questions. This is the final call for questions. Thank you for all of you who have sent in your questions. We appreciate it. All right, well, with that, we're gonna wrap up the webinar a little early. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this webinar. If you have any suggestions on things for us to do in the future, we are currently taking feedback for our 2021 webinar schedule. If you would like to fill out that short survey at the end, that would be very, very helpful to us. Thank you again for joining, and have a great rest of your morning.
Thanks, everyone.